Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity of sharing a little bit of us and the work that we did with the PAI. I'm Bruno Ohana. I am the CTO of Biologit. I'm also co-founder, and I have a background in computer science, machine learning, and those things. We're a startup based in Dublin. We started life about 3 years ago as a research project in Trinity College Dublin, and we spun out of the university and finished our first fundraising round back in December last year, which was about the time the pilot was beginning. So we were on the very early stages of our startup journey. And I want to talk a little bit about our industry and some of the things that we observed since the pilot. And I hope that can give a perspective of how those things work for a small company that needs to stay focused on the products and at the same time wants to accomplish a lot of on the documentation side of things for AI. All right, so let's get started. So, so the industry we're in is pharmacovigilance. This is part of the life sciences industry concerned with adverse events related to medications in the market or therapies or medical devices and so on. This is a regulated field and a very important one. I pulled some numbers here, some recent numbers for the European Union. Just short of 200,000 deaths a year can be attributed to some form of adverse event deriving from a prescribed medication or a therapy. And these days, pharmacovigilance evolved into other areas, like looking into not only adverse events because of the drug itself, but also medication errors, things like lack of efficacy and drug abuse and so on. So these all fall under the pharmacovigilance remit. And it's a serious problem, which means governments around the world pay a lot of attention to it. So there are frameworks in place in all different jurisdictions. In Europe, this is regulated by the European Medicines Agency, the FDA in the US, and so on. Generally, how it looks is this is a shared responsibility model, which means if you are, let's say, a pharma with a product on the market, then by law, you're mandated to perform certain activities to do with detection, collection of data, detection of events, making initial assessments, and then reporting this back to a regulatory authority, which will then decide on what is the right course of action, right? This can be from something as simple as updating the product label all the way to pulling the medication out of the markets if needs be, depending on the seriousness of the problem. And of course, regulators will reserve the right to go and audit your activities, not only on pharmacovigilance, but also on clinical developments, manufacturing, and so on. So audits are a fact of life in this industry. And if we zoom in on that top part there of this framework and take a look at what this process really looks like, it begins to look like a data processing pipeline. You know, there's lots of inputs on the left-hand side there. These are in blue, and the input undergoes different levels of assessment until there is some useful published data that can be shared with regulatory authorities or go into other sort of actions inside the pharma company. The types of inputs that we see can vary a lot. The ones that we work more closely with are the sort of unstructured text data coming from the scientific literature, but this can vary a lot. And this, this keeping the analogy on data pipeline, this is a complicated pipeline. There's lots of handoffs, lots of people involved, different systems, lots of opportunities for error. It's very laborious, and on top of all this, the volume of inputs data keeps growing, right? There's more and more articles being published on the literature every year. And the same is true for spontaneous reports coming from, let's say, consumers or from hospitals and so on. So that's incurring a growing volume of work to be done and more costs to have this done with the right level of quality. So we are in the so the scope of our work is in the scientific literature, and this is a bit of a historical document here. It's the first mention of these adverse events to do with this product called thalidomide. It was first reported back in the 50s and 60s, and turns out to be a very, very serious adverse reaction. And one of the things that sort of spearheaded the modern pharmacovigilance frameworks that exist today. And it's interesting to notice that this came from the scientific literature. So it is recognized as a very important source of data for monitoring events for products on the market. Because doctors and practitioners and their clinics will observe something and then write about it. And usually that makes its way into a journal. And fast forward a little bit, I won't be talking about our product a whole lot today, but just to say that because this is important and recognized, it's an activity that everybody needs to do. That's where we come in, and that's where we want to apply artificial intelligence. We want to make this process a lot more effective than it is today, and use AI in a variety of ways, not only as a means for users to sort of speed read an article, but also to go ahead and filter irrelevant ones out of the way. So the models here are very specific and very fine-tuned for the problems of the pharmacovigilance space. And one other interesting chart that will help us set the scene here is that this is a recent study that came out from the industry, asking a number of pharmaceutical industries from this industry body called Transcelerate about their level of investment on different technologies when it comes to pharmacovigilance. So the rows here are the steps on a pharmacovigilance workflow for adverse event case intake and processing. And the columns are different types of technology, and they're grouped into whether the company is planning, or is it in pilots, or is it in production. If the cell is red, that means there was more investment with respect to the previous year. If it's blue, there was less investment, and if it's whiter, there's nothing going on there. And I singled out the ones that are closer to the AI world. So there's a ML column, there's also natural language processing and NLG. And if you compare that to RPA or workflow, you can see that there's a lot to be done still, which is quite interesting. Like I said, this is a very recent survey. So the industry should be very motivated to go and automate a lot of their processes, since volume is growing and so on. So what's going on here? And I think part of the answer relates a lot to the topic of having good documentation. So when we started development in Biologit, we were aware of some, let's say, external drivers. So the first one is regulatory guidance. Regulatory guidance for our world is evolving. There's a lot being put out there, and we expect more to come. But you can see already from what's coming out that documentation will be fairly important. And typically, it's framed as a risk mitigator. So users need to be provided clear and essential information about the AI product so they can use it properly. And likewise, things like technical documentation or describing how the system works is also important. Again, for the same reason, but perhaps for a different kind of audience, really, right? So if you're someone on the customer side looking to implement a system and making a technical assessment, this is the time when those things will become important. But all in all, documentation is pretty prominent as a requirement on on the guidance that's coming out today. And the second one, which is to do with the results of that survey, is AI is still fairly new on pharmacovigilance, and what the industry needs to do as a whole is start taking steps towards adopting parts of this technology. As a vendor in this space, we want to make sure that we're sharing a lot of what we're doing, so that we can gain the trust of the industry, and at the same time contribute to this sort of conversation. And again, making our documentation external is pretty fundamental for this. This is a sort of high-level view of how we're thinking about the documentation that we produce. We want to have very strong internal and auditable documentation relating to how we build things. It all starts with our AI development lifecycle document, which describes the process at a high level. And from there, a number of secondary documents can be expected to be produced. And in producing those documents, that gives us an opportunity to sit down and think about what is it that we want to do, and also providing traceability on our decisions. And the good thing about this is that it's also very useful for producing the public-facing sort of documents that we also want to make. Model fact sheets and what goes on the product documentation, and any sort of publication that can come out of that. So there was let's say the general mindsets that we approached the pilots, and at that point we had some publications out, and we were very aware of the ABOUTML work, and in fact incorporated a lot of it into our own work. So let's move on to the pilots and what happened next. So we've seen this diagram before. I think this was a very interesting finding for us. We like to think that documentation is very integral to our process, but as it turns out, in reality, a lot of documentation is produced on release stage, and maybe some of it after the fact. So that's not ideal, and what we really want is for this to be part of the flow of updating our models or generating new models. The other interesting finding is, so this chart is the longitudinal surveys that happened during the pilot, and the question was to do with the level of quality of our documentation according to different dimensions. And so we did quite well on some, but one that we consistently needed to do better on was the audience, and something that you already mentioned. And maybe there's a little bit of the technical bias of us data scientists coming into this and approaching this problem. Right, so there's a model fact sheet, so that has everything that anyone would possibly ever want to know about our technology, right? Well, maybe model fact sheets and technical papers and so on, they certainly do have an audience, but it's not the only audience. And in many use cases, definitely in ours, it's not the main audience. There's a lot of different stakeholders that we need to communicate to in order to be successful. And the fact sheets is only part of the answer. This also came out on the written feedback. The documents were too technical, and who's the target audience, and so on. Another consistent topic here is that producing documentation is hard. It's especially for a small team. It will take time and effort to do them, and we want to make sure that we're doing that we're writing the right documents and be smart about it. So on the back of the survey results, one of the things that we did was we sat down and thought about things like who are the personas for our documentation, who are the artifacts that we want to produce, what are the tools that we can use, and we wrote a specification for all this. I think that that was very useful. It was a big list, and those things are, especially if you're in a regulated industry and you're thinking about all the documentation that needs to be written, it can feel quite daunting. But it's important for us. It was important to write it down and have a better picture of what we wanted to achieve. And since then, we made a lot of progress, and it's really great to see that little by little, the body of documents that we produce is more targeted and more relevant. Also, one other thing that we did on the back of the specification as well is making these more integral to our processes. So, we have documentation in our definition of done. This is great, but just writing on the document is of course not sufficient. And this is something that we need to be fully on board. And we have more forums now to discuss the progress on documentation and how do we want to improve them and make sure that those things become activities that will make progress on. The key words here is iterate on those things, because now we are in a position where we're getting a lot more feedback from auditors, from users, and so on. Here's an example of the types of artifacts that we envisaged and who they are for. And today we have a good handle on all of those, and we're always trying to improve what they look like. Another interesting observation here is this idea that transparency improves internal processes. I think that's absolutely true. If we're doing something internally in full knowledge that that information will need to be in a fact sheet that will be public and visible on the internet to everyone, I think that's a great incentive for us to sit down and think about, is everything adhering to the process, and is everything traceable, and can these numbers be justified, and so on. So so this is great in terms of process improvements on the internal side of things, even if it never makes its way to the fact sheet properly. And we can also see that since then, this investment in documentation is paying off. Now we're starting discussions with more technical vendor assessments, and we're being audited. And this is exactly the sort of artifacts that we bring into those discussions. And the feedback has been overall quite good. The second observation is this idea of quality management. So that's very integral to how life sciences processes and how typically things get done. There are well understood quality frameworks. They go by the name of GXP, good pharmacovigilance practices, good manufacturing practices, and so on. There's one for us as well, for IT systems. It's called GAMP. And what you find in those frameworks is things you would typically find in a robust engineering organization. How do you think about change controls? How do you manage risks? What do you do to promote changes into production? And what's your design and requirements gathering processes like, and so on. It's not, there's nothing maybe too unique about GAMP, but the good thing about following one of those frameworks is that when you're inside this industry, they are pretty ubiquitous. And so following GAMP means everybody's speaking the same language. So that is important. And instead of GAMP, it could be something else completely different in your industry, but I'm pretty sure there is one for your industry as well, and it's a good thing to be aligned to it. just from the perspective of facilitating those discussions. The other good thing about it is when it comes to AI, in pharmacovigilance, GAMP is being extended to factor in the specific AI considerations. So because everybody understands GAMP, and so that's a nice baseline to start from. And if you're doing some work on GAMP already, then there's only incremental efforts in taking care of the AI considerations. So it's a good head start as well. So just a couple of examples there. GMLP and Transcelerate, these two came out at different points last year, and the whole area of quality management gets a lot of reference in there. And in general, the key thing here is that those things can give you a head start for high stakes AI. And just to give a more concrete example, this is coming from the European Union AI Act, and there's language directly referring to quality management systems there. And in fact, some commentators are pointing out that the whole AI Act borrows quite a bit from pharmacovigilance frameworks that already exist, which is great, and in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. Because pharmacovigilance it's in a different domain, but it has lots of overlapping concerns with AI transparency and safe AI and so on. I think that the two industries can learn a lot from one another. And what's next for us? So I'll leave you with those three quotes from the surveys, from the pilots as well. Keeping documentation an active process. Yeah, I think that's super important. We're always iterating on all our development lifecycle and making it better, and that includes documentation. And it's good to see that some time has passed since the pilot. I think we're in much better shape, and I'm sure we'll continue to make a lot of progress here. The other interesting observation is this idea that the engagement model will drive the documentation requirements, which is also absolutely true, and something that as a startup we need to pay close attention to as we discover our different ways for product market fit. This is going to drive a lot of the documentation. One example that doesn't exist very strongly today for us, but might very well exist in the near future, is developer-friendly documentation, right? As we integrate into other systems. And finally, the other question that I think we need to obsess about is this idea of adoption. For us, it's not just about having a manual that we can refer users to. We really need to bring users into this journey of taking advantage of AI and what are the risks and how to bring those things into your day-to-day workflow, which is a process that's documented and live within the constraints of the regulated industry. How to bring in this new technology in a way that is safe and that's going to be beneficial. It's certainly something that we need to be very intentional about, and it certainly doesn't stop on explaining the model from a technical standpoint or explaining what the tool does. We think there's more there, and we continue to think about this as we go forward. And with that, I think that's all I had. Thank you very much again for the opportunity, and